Hello, I'm Rebecca the Maths Lady and welcome to video 8 in this series on teaching number to children aged 9 to 11, and this video is all about long multiplication. Now I'm going to change the format for these videos just for this video because a lot of people have been asking me about the method of teaching that I recommend and why it's different to other methods. So in this video, I'm going to show you how most people would teach long multiplication in what we call a traditional or a stepwise approach, a small steps approach. And then I'll show you what I recommend, which is a low floor, high ceiling structural approach, to use technical terms. And finally, I'll contrast the two and show you where they're the same and where they're different, and give you a bit of insight into the backgrounds and when each method is more appropriate. So first of all, let's look at a small steps approach, which is what most schools use. So the topic is long multiplication, and that means that we are multiplying two numbers that are both more than 10. So here's an example, 47 times 32. Now with a small steps approach, the children all need the entry requirements for the lesson, and the entry requirements for this lesson would be an understanding of the distributive law, which means that you know that, for example, this calculation could be done by doing 30 lots of 47 and 2 lots of 47 and adding those two results together. The second thing children would need to know is how to do short multiplication. So they're going to need that for calculating 2 lots of 47. And the third thing they're going to need to know is how to multiply a number by a multiple of 10. In this case, it's 30. So they need to know how to do 47 times 30. And if they know all those things, then they're going to understand this method. So let's look at it now. So a teacher who is working with students who understand those three things, the distributive law, short multiplication and multiplication by a multiple of 10, could teach this topic in this way. They could say we're simply going to split this multiplication, so we'll do 2 lots of 47 and 30 lots of 47. So we'll set it up like this, 47 times 32. We're going to do it in 2 parts and add those answers together. So if they were being organised, and I do recommend this if you're using this method, they'd keep a note on what they're doing. So we're doing 2 times 47 here. We can just follow the short multiplication method. So 2 7s are 14, 4 down, 1 to carry. And 2 4s are 8, and we've got our 1, so that becomes 9. And then below that, we're going to do 30 times 47. And if we assume the children have a method for that, then we could do that quite quickly. There's various methods for it, so whichever the teacher has taught and the children know is fine. But in essence, we need to put a 0 in. 3 7s are 21, carry the 2, 3 4s are 12, and that's 14. And then we add those two answers together with column addition, so I'm assuming they know that as well. And the answer is 1,504. So that's a small steps approach. Children came into the lesson knowing 3 small steps, and they've added 1 more, which is based on combining those steps to learn 1 new skill. Now, the method that I like to teach teachers to be able to use, should they need it, is a low floor, high ceiling structural approach. So first of all, we need to consider what is the fundamental structure supporting children's thinking about multiplication at primary school, and it's array. So we draw an array to support thinking about a long multiplication. I'm going to start with a slightly easier one, and then we'll look at the one we've just looked at. So the easy one I'd start with would be 19 times 4. And you can give worksheets like these to a class of children and just check with them that they understand that they can find that answer by totalling up 19 lots of 4, and they can do that simply by counting the squares. And let them go. Let them try and puzzle out the answer to that long multiplication. And every child should be able to do that, because all they've got to be able to do is count. But it's a bit boring and a bit long-winded. So quite quickly, you want to encourage the children to look for shortcuts for finding the total number of squares there. And there are loads of ways of doing that, and your children can get really creative. It's lovely to get them to describe their methods to each other. The articulation of their own ideas is a really important skill to learn in maths. It's really good for them. Some might reach for the Dean's blocks and start covering up 100 squares at a time, sectioning those off, writing 100 in there. That's fine. All sorts of stuff can happen. And you want to let children do that until they're really confident and they're really looking for a standard shortcut that will be reliable for them. And the one that we're aiming towards to support children's thinking about the standard method for long multiplication is to cut this into 2 sections. So you could have 10 lots of 19, if we cut it here, and 4 lots of 19. Or you could do it the other way round with 10 lots of 14 and 9 lots of 14. So you cut it this way. Either is fine. I'm going to cut it this way into 10 lots of 19 and 4 lots of 19. So 19 times 10 is 190. 19 times 4, well, we can review short multiplication if we need to. We can use Dean's apparatus, or we can use mental methods. We could do 20 times 4 and knock 1 4 off, or any other method that works, there's plenty, to find out that that is 76. And then we can just add 76 to 190. Well, 10 of it takes us to 200, so we've got 266. So typically in my first lesson with a class of children, we're aiming towards this kind of level. And we'd come back in the second lesson and practice lots of these, where at least one of the numbers that you're multiplying in there is less than 20. So we're just splitting it into 10 and the extra. And then we can move on to harder questions. So the question we looked at before was 47 times 32. Just moved on to ½ centimetre squared paper, so that fits nicely now. And we asked children to try and use shortcuts. They can be creative, but over time they should find that if they cut 10 rows at a time off, then it's quite manageable. I'll just do that now. And that's what it looks like when it's done. Each of these are easy, they're just 470. 47 times 2, we could use short multiplication or we could just double it. So the answer, children can clearly see, is going to be the total of these 4 numbers. Now let's compare that to the formal written method we used before. I would start to introduce this method at this stage. Obviously the 94, 2 times 47 is just here. But the 30 times 47 here, we're just tuning into a little bit more detail in this method and stopping to notice that 30 times 47 is really 3 times 10 times 47, because that's 30. So 10 times 47 is 470. So we're really doing 3 times 470, which is what we could see in this diagram. And that gives us 0 here, the 1 here with 2 to carry, 3 4s are 12, and we had 2 to carry, so that's 14. And of course we get the same answer. But if a child wasn't that confident, they could spread this out and show 94, add 470, add 470, add 470, and of course they're going to get the same answer. Fingers crossed. And then we can do lots of practice, but if children are making mistakes, we can ask them to draw diagrams or go back to the apparatus or use squared paper so they can puzzle out their own mistakes and correct them. So let's compare and contrast the 2 ways of teaching now. Here are 9 ways in which I'm going to compare them. You'll immediately see that the first 2 refer to the name of the method I'm using, low floor, high ceiling maths. So let's see what that means in the context of the examples we've just looked at. The floor for the maths are the skills that the child needs before they're able to engage with this topic. So in the small steps approach, the child needed to understand the distributive law, which was splitting a multiplication in two parts and knowing that they could do each part and recombine them to find the total. It's knowing how to do short multiplication and knowing how to multiply by multiples of 10. But in the teaching method that I showed you second, all the child needs to be able to do is to count. So that's one reason for the name of the approach that I use, low floor, because children don't need much maths to access the lesson. Now let's look at the high ceiling part. With the first method, children are going to learn a method for long multiplication. Second method, along the way they will explore lots of methods for long multiplication. They'll come up with their own strategies. If you're a teacher who's used to the grid method for long multiplication, you should see it in the array, how you can split the array into 4 parts that represent the 4 parts of that method. And people will come across that method and make the links between those two key methods, but also to lots of others. And children will be connecting long multiplication to every other aspect of multiplication. Multiplication of fractions, multiplication of mixed numbers, and they're laying the foundations for algebraic multiplication and much more as they're in the future of their maths. And the conversation can go anywhere. And I've seen really powerful conversations come out of this type of teaching. So that's why the second method is a high ceiling method. We're not just adding one step to a child's learning. In the single lesson, they can go from working on counting right through to really powerful and creative maths well beyond the target teaching point for the lesson. So we've looked at the low floor and the high ceiling. Now let's look at what a structural approach means. In a small steps approach, people who write schemes with small steps approaches often try to add apparatus in. So they'll often try and draw a picture of some apparatus or recommend some. And then they'll suggest that you start with the apparatus and then move through a drawing and into the abstract written method. And sometimes it's really well done, and sometimes it's done so well it's not very much different from what I recommend. But often it's done quite badly, and just researching this topic, I was quite shocked by what I saw in some of the schemes of teaching that claimed to use apparatus. The apparatus wasn't well used, it wasn't helpful. With the low floor, high ceiling structural approach that I use, we think about structures first. What's the important structure here? And it's array. And we make sure that children are secure in why multiplication is well represented with array. And then we pick whichever apparatus is most handy and most useful for us. So for the array structure, we might use centimetre squared paper. We might use Dean's apparatus. We might use smaller squared paper. I've got my magnetic Dean's, or you might use array on your interactive whiteboard. They are all different representations of array, and you can pick whichever best suits your teaching environment. So what about the impact of the different teaching methods on child development? Well, with a small steps approach, everything you're trying to teach the child is very clearly defined in advance. And in teaching it, you may create opportunities for discussion, but that discussion is quite narrow because you clearly know where you're going with it. But with the low floor, high ceiling structural approach, using the structures creates all sorts of opportunities for creativity and wider discussion, and for children to unpack their own thinking and express their thinking through whichever apparatus you're using to represent that structure. If you want to, you can make that lesson quite closed and quite driven and focused as to where you're going, but you don't have to. If you want to slow down and let the children be creative, you can let them bring everything they know about multiplication and number into that lesson. And they often go further than that and bring their wider experiences into the lesson. And you're teaching children to be much more self-aware, to be much more self-confident about their own creative thinking about maths. They can be involved in extended discussions. They can learn to listen to other children's different methods and respect them. and where there are periods where the children are exploring methods, which is what I recommended with these before you nudge them towards the particular method we're looking for. And there are more opportunities to make connections between different subjects and between the classroom experience and the child's life, and therefore learning can become deeper. Okay, let's look at social equity, which means that all children can access the lesson and thrive in the lesson, no matter what their background. So if you're running a small steps culture, then there are really two ways to do it. Either you have to be super organised and very focused and know exactly what you're doing and exactly where every child is, and you need those children in on a regular basis, or you're going to struggle. Or, and this commonly happens, the children come from families where their parents can help them or they can get them tutors. So unless Small Steps is run with a tremendous amount of energy and oversight and organisation, then it becomes socially exclusive. With the low floor, high ceiling approach, children can engage with the lesson and the teaching even if they've missed huge chunks of maths, even if they've been up all night because a family member's been involved in substance abuse or there's been chaos at home and they've not slept. And I've always chosen to teach in the schools with most challenges, partly because these methods work so well there. It's given me the chance to explore the teaching methods that I think are the best teaching methods, because nothing else really works in those circumstances. Because if you've got a lot of children coming and going and you don't know their background, or a lot of children have substantial gaps in their learning, then small steps approaches are going to really struggle unless you've got a lot of teaching assistance. People often talk about Finnish maths education, and that is based on social equity, and you see a lot of these strategies going on there. Low floor, high ceiling teaching used to thrive in the UK, and experts from around the world came to do their PhDs here and observe it. And Pasi Salberg, who's a great orator about Finnish education, he's now working in Australia, but he was one of those. Applicability. We've already discussed that small steps approaches work where children have the prior skills that they need to be able to access that kind of teaching. So that tends to be in a school with a whole teaching system that ensures that, that's designed in tremendous detail and is supported by a significant number of teaching assistants who can run interventions with children if they have got behind for any reason. It also means that the small steps approach can work very well in tutoring, because as a tutor you can try it and you can see if the one child you're working with deeply understands what you're doing or not. And if they do, then it's good enough. So that's fine. And in a one-to-one situation, you don't get the benefits of the conversations that are so powerful in a classroom that you get with the low floor, high ceiling structural teaching. The other thing you need really for a small steps approach is for children to be in single year groups. So if you're teaching a class that has children from several years in, you're going to struggle with that approach. It's just not designed for it. So the low floor, high ceiling structural teaching really does work with mixed year teaching, because the floor is so low that children across all year groups can access the lesson. And there are lots of benefits to mixed year teaching. The chance for a child to be first an apprentice and then to come back and be an expert and to explain the maths to younger children is a very powerful learning experience. And low floor, high ceiling structural teaching really takes advantage of that. And the other situation where low floor, high ceiling structural teaching is really the best method to use is in situations of chaos where children are coming and going and you can't control their background knowledge because they're often not there. And that's one of the reasons that I'm rushing to get all these videos out, because they are going to work in classrooms that are affected by coronavirus, where teachers only see the children some of the time, where some of the learning has to be at home, but it may or may not happen. It doesn't matter. If you've prepared a low floor, high ceiling structural lesson, all the children are going to be able to access it when they're with you, and they're going to be able to learn in a really powerful way. And it's much more efficient time-wise. It looks slower at first, but it really isn't, because the depth of understanding that comes off it is tremendous. And when you teach one topic, you're not just teaching that tiny bit of topic, you're teaching the whole of maths. Everything's connected. So lots of other topics get reviewed and revised, and they all connect up with each other, and children develop a much more stable and complete system of understanding mathematics that supports all their other thinking about maths. Let's now look at the skill sets that teachers need. For a small steps approach, the person who's doing the teaching needs to understand all the steps in maths that are prior requirements for that bit of teaching. People who are teaching this way generally work with a planned system that they're following, so they need to understand how to use that system. The low floor, high ceiling structural teaching has generally in the past been harder to learn. It's been taught in teacher training in universities by experts who spend their time reading all this stuff and talking to each other, and who work across many schools and are able to share best practice routes up by observing what works. So that's why I've created these videos, so that any teacher can decide what topic they're going to teach, look for the relevant video, and in 10 to 20 minutes, depending on the length of the video, they will deeply understand how to teach that topic. And apart from that, the other skill set that teachers who are teaching in this way need is that they need to be deeply observational and continuously listening to children and responding to what it is the children see and say. It comes very naturally to some people, but for others it's a challenge. For some people, they want their classroom to be that controlled environment where they know exactly what's going on and they feel completely in charge all the time. So for those teachers, this type of teaching is a challenge. What about the accountability structures? How will people know if you're teaching well or not? Well, in a small steps approach, in schools, it's often predefined exactly what you're doing in every stage of every lesson. So if you're doing what you're told to do, then you're doing well, and the outcome should be good at the end of that. So there's complete accountability for every moment of every lesson of the year. That isn't the case with the low floor, high ceiling structural teaching. You're teaching and you're getting on with it. Children will do lots of practice along the way, and towards the end of the year we'll use systems to practice every skill set for the year, and you'll be able to diagnose if children have gaps and fill those gaps. So the accountability structures for a school that's working in a low floor, high ceiling structural way need to be end of year, at most end of term accountability systems for measuring children's progress. So if that's not the culture for your school, then you need a small steps approach. And if other teachers, rather than the classroom teacher, want to monitor what's going on, then that's generally done through lesson study and exploring and listening to what the teacher is thinking and what they're doing and why they're doing it, rather than by checking to see that they're doing exactly what they've been told to do. So the origins of these two teaching methods. The small steps method tends to come from schools where the parents can help the children and they like to know what the children are doing. Works really well there. Also comes from schools that are extremely authoritarian, where the head likes to be in control of what everyone's doing all the time. And some of the schools that operate like that are great schools. It also comes from the accountability structure. In England, our education regulator is Ofsted, and they come in and they observe teaching. And it's not so much the case these days, but it used to be the case that they would expect the teacher to be following a pre-written plan, and they would be in for 20 minutes and they would be judging the teacher to see if they were doing that. So in that kind of circumstance, it was much easier to use a small steps approach because the Ofsted inspector generally didn't understand a low floor, high ceiling structural approach, sadly. And the final point there is that in England and in some other countries, we have a populist agenda in government where they don't want experts because they don't want anyone criticising what they're doing. And if you get rid of the experts, then it's much more difficult to sustain low floor, high ceiling structural teaching because it's usually communicated by experts. And what are the origins of the low floor, high ceiling approach? Well, it thrives where people reflect on maths education and read the research and talk to each other, because it's just so good and so powerful and so transformative for children. Gets them all engaged, all thriving, and you see children making incredible progress from really low levels to really high levels very quickly. And it's so rewarding to do because you're changing children's lives so quickly. This type of teaching also originates in the schools with the most challenges, which are the schools that I've always chosen to work in, because many of the children in those schools have chaotic backgrounds, have missed a lot of school, have missed a lot of their learning, and you have to use methods that work with that. Otherwise, you're going to have a lot of problems. And you're taking those children with all the disadvantages already and making them more disadvantaged because they can't cope with the method of teaching that you're using. Now, my aim here is not to be derogatory about small steps teaching. It works really well in a lot of circumstances. And there are quite a lot of circumstances in which I would choose to use it. It would be the right thing. But there are also a lot of circumstances where low floor, high ceiling teaching is much better. And I think more teachers are going to need it as they're juggling the chaos of the winter to come, which is why I'm trying to share it so it's there for you if you want it. You certainly don't have to adopt this approach completely. If you're struggling to teach one topic using your small steps approach, then just find a video and swap over to this to teach that topic and then swap back to your scheme. That's fine as well. Often you'll find that the video is very similar to your scheme. There are big overlaps between the different types of teaching. And there are plenty of circumstances where you would still follow your existing scheme of work, but by having watched the video, you become much more adaptable. If you see a child who's struggling, you're much more likely to understand exactly why they're struggling and know how to help them. And the final thing to say, that in the universities where we do teacher education, we always taught teachers that you think you know how the maths is done because you know how to do it. But there are lots of ways to do maths, and the person next to you may be doing it in a completely different way, and you're often unaware of that. And this structural approach unites all the methods, so it makes it much easier for people who are seeing the maths differently to communicate with each other. It's one of the reasons the learning is so powerful and universal and inclusive. The other type of low floor, high ceiling teaching, which can be very powerful, is the kind of low floor, high ceiling teaching where there's a problem, a real life situation or an imaginable situation, which is a hook for the lesson. When you set up a powerful context that every child deeply buys into and understands, you can create a low floor, high ceiling lesson where the discussions can go to very high levels as well. So some teachers use that type of teaching, and it's great, and I'd really recommend it. But if there's a topic you're struggling to teach, then it's this structural approach that I'm sharing on my channel that you're looking for. If you've made it to the end of this video, then thank you. I hope you can see that I've got a passion for sharing this type of teaching. I've taught this way. I've seen how it changes children's lives. I've worked with a lot of primary schools that have worked in this way and they love it. It's not so very different. It's just a deeper level of understanding of teaching than most teachers experience. And once you've got it, the power to be able to fix children is just lovely. So thank you for caring enough to find out about it. I really appreciate it. I often feel very lonely because for the last 10 years, the government has only supported a small steps approach. And we have maths hubs in England and they're not even allowed to communicate information about this training in their emails. So it's been absolutely a labour of love for 10 years, and I'm so grateful for the schools that have worked with me. And thank you to you too now for watching. I hope you love your maths teaching as much as I do, and I wish you well. The next video will be about the 6 ways of dealing with remainders from divisions when you don't get a whole number answer. I hope you'll join me for that soon, and I will go back to just telling you how it's done rather than explaining all of this extra stuff. If you want to chat to me about the wider stuff, please come and join me at my live streams. They're 9 o'clock British time on Sunday mornings. Or you can just add a comment to this video and I will see it and do my best to respond. I love your thoughts. I love your comments. Bye for now.